All right, so our focus today is JavaScript. Again, for some of you, this might be yesterday's news. For others, it might be a good, much needed review. And for others, it might be like you might be learning some new concepts here. No matter where you fall there, again, the end goal of today is everyone should be on the same page with their JavaScript basic understanding. I know, again, most of your pre-work was meant to make sure you practice JavaScript and pick up these fundamentals, but we're just going to kind of go over them and make sure we're solidified on them today. We're going to be learning Python tomorrow, which is probably a lot more new to many of you because again, the pre-work didn't focus on Python, but we'll wait for that for tomorrow. So today we're going to be going over JavaScript. So let's just cover the basics, make sure we have no questions about it. And if we do, definitely ask your questions. It's meant to be interactive, not just me lecturing to you. So again, question pops up, just raise your hand in the Zoom room. Make sure I'll try to call on you if I see that hand up. All right, so let's talk about data types first. So data types are the types of data that your application can interpret. At the end of the day, your computer stores everything as ones and zeros. So this is what your computer sees behind the scenes. But the question is, how are these values interpreted by your application? And that's where data types come into play. So we could have several different data types. We can have strings, and you probably have used most of these, if not all of them. We could have integers or floats. We could have Boolean values. What else can we have? I guess it's null and undefined. So let's talk about some of these, make sure we understand how they all work. All right, so starting with strings, let's talk about how we create a string. So if I wanted to create a variable, I'm just going to use let for now. We'll talk about the different types shortly, I promise. But let's say let my value equals, just say Bill Gates. All right, so you can create a string by putting in double quotes. This is called a string literal because this is just a string value. Again, behind the scenes, they're all being converted to ones and zeros, but we don't care about what the computer's doing with it. We care what our application's doing. So we're saying, hey, these ones and zeros are going to be used as a string in our application. You can also use single quotes. If I say other value equals LeBron James, you can use single quotes. I prefer to use double quotes. That's just a personal preference, but single quotes and double quotes mean the same exact thing. Both of these are creating the same string value. There's no difference between single quotes and double quotes. All right, you could also do string interpolation, which we saw in the previous challenge example. Some value equals, and this is where we use backticks. So again, backticks is that key right underneath your escape key. Is probably one of the least used keys on my keyboard before I was programming in JavaScript, but backticks give you these two slashes, and then you could add some string here. So let's go with Barack Obama. All right, so all three of these are considered string values. They're just, you use double quotes, single quotes, or backticks, and you create string values. The advantage of backticks, as we mentioned, is this is string interpolation. So if I wanted to put, some variable here, I would do $, and let's have a variable up here. So let x equals 44. We put in x here, and now sorry, VS Code is probably when turning. All right, so this allows me to kind of insert a variable within my string. So now if I printed this string out, it should read Barack Obama 44. Was he the 44th president? 45? I can't keep track of president numbers, but whatever number he was. But if I did the same thing here, where I did $x here, notice that VS Code's highlighting shows me that this is just a string. So if I actually printed this out, this would actually show LeBron James, $, curly brace, X, and the curly brace. So this, again, strings with a double quote or single quotes cannot be interpolated, as you cannot just put variables in them like we're doing with string interpolation. So to prove this to you, let me just do a quick console log. So I do my value. I could do console log other value and console.log some value. Not the best variable names. They're not descriptive, but I hope you guys get the idea here. So if I print these three out, I'll do node main.js. Notice the 3 lines that are printed out. So I printed out my value first, which is Bill Gates, because that is my actual string. Notice that LeBron James has that $X because that is a string literal. It's not not doing anything special with this $sign curly braces. However, if you use backticks, this is where we get string interpolation, where we can actually use variables in line here. So notice that it says Barack Obama 44. It does not show, curly brace X or anything like that. You could have multiple variables. Again, we saw this in the past example. If I had another variable called Y, I can have as many variables in my string interpolation. There's no limit to it. Porfi, you have a question?
Yeah, just real quick, with the string interpolation, can you still use quotation marks inside of it in case like it's Barack Obama said, and then you put a quote in there with a variable?
Sure, let's give it a try. So let's say Barack Obama said Y. Let's say Y is hello, Quebec. Can we put quotes as a question? And let's give that a try. So we put actual double quotes in here, and that should work just fine. So notice we actually get quotes in here. The same holds true for single quotes and double quotes. So if I'm using single quotes here, I am allowed to use, let's say Bill Gates, if I wanted to Bill Gates with an apostrophe, I can use single quotes within double quotes, and that's going to be fine. However, you cannot use double quotes within double quotes just like you normally would. Like I can't say Bill Gates said and then put double quotes here, I have a lot of money. Notice when I put double quotes within double quotes, that kind of breaks my string. It now thinks this is a string and this is a string, and I think this is just nonsense or some random variables I've not created. If I wanted to put quotes in here, I could put single quotes like that. So if I print this out, notice Bill Gates said, I have a lot of money. Or if you really want to put double quotes, you can escape them. I believe if you do backslash is called an escape character. So if I do backslash quotes, this will let me put double quotes in here. So the backslash won't be printed, but this will actually print the quotation mark here. So let's run this and see what the output is. Notice I have double quotes within my double quoted string. So it is possible, but you need to escape this character telling like the interpreter, hey, this isn't the end of my string. This is a character I want within my string. So you guys all have probably seen escape characters before. Like when you want a new line, you type in \n, and that is interpreted as a new line character, not as an n, right? So if I did this, now this part would be on a new line. And get rid of the double quotes. So notice Bill Gates said, and then I have a new line. So again, the backslash is called an escape character. There are pre-reserved. It's not like I'm making this up on the spot. You can do a Google for all the escape characters you can have. New lines, there's, we did escaping for a quote. There's a bunch of other ones. So anything that's reserved, you can escape that for a string. Any questions on using escape characters or what double quotes, single quotes, backticks mean? Okay, so again, I prefer double quotes. I know a lot of developers prefer single quotes. To each your own for those two. But if you want to use string interpolation, use backticks. You have to use backticks. There's no options if you want string interpolation. All right, so that covers strings. Let's talk about ints and floats. So if you want to represent some numbers, you can create integers. So to create an integer, I could say let num equals 44, like I did above with x. Without quotes, if I put this in quotes, this is a string. Without it, this is an integer now. So this is a numeric type called an integer. You could also have floats. So let pi equals 3.14. If you put a decimal point in there, now this is a floating point number. All right, so just know you have the ability to have decimal precision or just integers. Any questions on numeric values? I think they're probably pretty straightforward. You can do basic operations with numeric numbers. So I could do, let's do console.log, let's add num plus pi. So you can do basic addition. I assume that's not too surprising, but we'll talk about some of those operators a bit later. But if I wanted to add these two numbers together, it's going to add an integer with a float, and the resulting number should be a float because that is more precise. So if I ran this, let's get rid of our strings. We don't need to see our strings output each time now. So if I run main.js, notice we get 47.14 because we had a floating point number with an integer that results in a floating point number. Andrew, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Just from something I previously learned, maybe you could clarify. I think isn't everything like a float in JavaScript? in the way it's written?
That's a great question. I actually don't know.
Because I asked because like, isn't it different in Python? And like, that's something like we have to think about when we do like number calculations in Python.
Taking that to a higher level, there are definitely language specific differences. I actually am not familiar with everything being a float in JavaScript. That's quite possible. So I think I need to read up more on that. I don't know if anyone else has any more details on that, but it's possible that everything is a float in JavaScript. But yeah, different languages have different implementation for certain things. That is kind of the headache of learning multiple languages at the same time. The basic concepts are the same, but certain small differences exist, like between Python and JavaScript. So we'll see that tomorrow when Raphael introduces Python. Jesse, you have a question?
Yeah, more of an ease of use. When you're using the to comment out all your console logs and stuff, how did you highlight all of them and then comment them all out?
Great question. I actually meant to go over this during the Visual Studio Code introduction yesterday. Visual Studio Code has a bunch of shortcuts, and I know very few of them, but the one that's I use commonly, if you hit Command / on your Mac, that's going to toggle between commenting and uncommenting a block section. On Windows, it's probably like Control or Shift /. I'm sure you can find the equivalent. But I don't know if you guys spied on my bookmarks here. I actually have a VS Code keyboard shortcuts. There, again, as I mentioned, there's a ton of shortcuts. You can Google for Mac OS or Windows, and it'll show you all the shortcuts that exist in VS Code, and they're quite handy. Some of them I use a lot. Some I'll probably never use, but probably could get use out of. So definitely get more familiar with VS Code shortcuts. But yeah, thanks for asking that. That one is one I use a lot. So again, Command / gives me quick commenting. All right, so we talked about numbers, nothing too exciting there. Let's talk about Booleans. So let is happy equals true. We do let is warm. I'm in Chicago, so it is not warm. Booleans are just true and false values. It's one or the other. There's no intermediary. There's no maybe true. It's either true or false, yes or no. So anytime you need to have a yes or no answer, you want to use Booleans. You couldn't use integers, right? You could say 1 could be your true and 0 could be false, but that's, again, not the proper use of integers. You want to use Booleans when it's just a black or white, yes or no, just two values and no more additional possible values. All right, so Booleans, you can use Booleans inside of if statements. So we'll get to if statements, I guess, a little later, but if is warm, maybe, console log, I don't need a jacket. So again, if statements use Booleans. So whatever you're putting into the if statement condition has to evaluate to a Boolean. So in this case, if this is true, it's going to execute this. If it's not true, obviously this won't get into here. But there's also a concept of Truthy and Falsey. So true and false are the two Boolean states. But there's also concepts of Truthy and Falsey. Kind of weird words, but they exist in JavaScript. The idea here is that other data types like numbers or even strings can kind of be coerced into being a true or false value. What I mean by that is, what if you have something like if 0, if num console log into non-zero integers are truthy. All right, so notice I'm using a numeric value here. My value of num here is 44. Let me get more space here. You can do this. This is not recommended, but this is totally valid. Meaning this number will be converted into a true or false value. In this case, non-zero numbers are considered truthy. So if I actually ran this node main.js, I got an error. All right, errors happen. Not sure where that happened. Let me count this out. Module not found.
You put
JST.
yeah.
Sorry, yeah, I just got that too. Thank you. Always good to read the error messages because that's what it was telling me. Not JST, JS. All right, so if num, I got rid of that. Commented too much. Try a third time. All right, there we go. So notice we actually printed that out because we got into this if statement. So non-zero numbers are considered truthy. If you want a full list of items that are truthy and non-truthy, or sorry, truthy and falsey, you can hit the webs, but falsey values, there's a very small list of falsey values. Everything else is considered truthy. Falsey values would be empty string, 0, null, undefined. We need to talk about some of these, but there's a list of them. You could do a quick Google. Let's do a quick Google right now. I bet I could find it. So falsey values in JavaScript. There's like 4, maybe 5 or 6 of them. So let's go with MSDN. All right, so here's your table. Everything in this table are considered falsey values. So false is literally false. 0, -0, those are falsey. Same thing with big int, that's just a different data type. Empty string, so any double quotes, single quotes, backticks that have no string value, those are considered falsey. Also none, undefined, not a number, document.all. I actually don't know what document.all is, but again, these are the only values that are considered falsey. Everything else is truthy. So if you have, a number or a non-empty string, if you're using that as a condition, that will automatically be treated as if it's true. But I'm saying it's possible to do this, but don't always rely on this. In this case, I would say, not equal to 0 to be explicit about what I'm checking here. All right, so just understand there's a concept of truthy and falsey. Most things will be correlated to truthy when you're trying to use it as a Boolean, but there are some things that be falsey. Again, if you want a reminder, just go to the web, false, 0, null, undefined, those are falsey values. Any questions on Booleans or truthy, falsey concepts? Just a naming convention here. So notice I prepend my Booleans with is. That's a personal preference. That's not a standard, but I'd recommend it just because when I'm reading my code, if I see something that has an is prepended with it, I know it's going to be a yes or no answer. So is happy? Yes or no? Is it warm? Yes or no? Again, that's personal preference. You don't have to. I'm just kind of pointing out what I'm doing here. All right, let's carry on. So we talked about Booleans. Let's talk about some special data types. So there's 2 special data types called null and undefined. These kind of can get confusing, but we want to make sure we understand the difference between them. Null, this is explicitly setting something to be nothing. And of course, I have typos, explicitly. Okay. All right, so when you literally want something to be nothing, so the concept of nothing, you will set it to null. So you could, I could have a variable let num equals null. This is fine. This is just saying num is literally nothing. It's not 0. 0 has a value. So, if I did let other num equals 0, these are 2 different things. Here I've specifically said the value of other num is 0. Here I said it's nothing. It's not 0. It's not a string. It's just literally nothing. So the concept of nothing, that is what null is representing here. And there are many use cases where you want to use null to clearly say nothing has been set yet. This is different than undefined. Normally speaking, you're not going to be using undefined, but you might get undefined values. So undefined, on the other hand, means the value is not known. All right, so again, this sounds similar, but these are actually distinct data types. So the way I kind of mentally think about these 2 is, let's say you have a bucket, and then you look inside that bucket and you see there's nothing in it. The value of that bucket would be null. However, if there's a bucket off in the distance and I can't really peer into it, I'm just looking at the bucket. The bucket in this case is a variable. I don't know what's in that bucket. There could be something in it. There could be integers in there. There could be a string in there. There could be an array in there. There could be, donuts in there, or there could be nothing at all. It's undefined. So whenever you get a value that's undefined, that's your application saying, hey, the value of this is not known. It could be nothing. It could be something. We just don't, for whatever reason, your logic led to an undefined value. Any questions on the difference between null and undefined? One common case where you might get undefined is when you have a function. So I know we're kind of jumping ahead, but hopefully you guys have seen functions before. My function maybe I do some stuff in this function like console log I'm in my function. If I do something like let return value equals my function. So we'll talk about return values again. So maybe kind of getting ahead, but so this function, I'm calling my function right here, and I'm assigning whatever this function is returning into a variable. But in this case, my function has no return keyword. Nothing is being passed back. I am printing something. Now, this is a distinction that some questions we're asking pre-work. I want to make sure we're all solid on this. Console.log has no implications on your application's logic. Excuse me. This is simply just throwing a line out to the console so that we, users or developers can, excuse me, can see it. This again has no impact on the logic that's being done by your application. The return statement here, this actually passes something back out of this function. So console.log is not passing anything around in your application. It's simply saying, all right, you told me to print something to the screen. I'm doing that, done. Nothing else is happening. Return is actually how you pass a value back. In this case, if you don't have return value, this leads to undefined for return value. So I did a console.log of return value. I didn't pass anything back, so the return value here is undefined. It's not known what it was. So if I do this, num, all right, using the same variable again, once. All right, so notice I'm in my function because I actually called my function on line 49. But then notice I get undefined here. That's because I'm trying to print out the value of return value, but that was never set to anything legitimate. Right? This is not the same as null. I can return null here. Or return null, I'm saying, all right, my function is literally returning nothing. So if I do this, notice I'll get a different value here. I actually get null, meaning literally nothing got returned versus unknown got returned. All right, everyone good on the difference between null and undefined? All right, I'll take your silence as we're good. All right, so those are your basic data types. We have some more advanced data types. So let me get some space here that you might have seen. Hopefully you have seen arrays because we use them a lot. There's also objects. I'm just gonna put dictionaries here because that's a Python term and I prefer that term. But they're called objects in JavaScript and arrays in JavaScript. In Python, they're called lists and dictionaries. I prefer that terminology, but just so we're not using the correct terminology for JavaScript, we're gonna talk about arrays and objects. These in other languages are called data structures, data types in JavaScript. So it doesn't really matter what they're, what they're called, it's what they actually represent. So arrays are a collection of something. So if I want to create an array, I could do let my array. To create an array, you want to use square brackets. So anything in square brackets is treated as an array. So in this case, I could put an array of numbers. So let's say a bunch of these. I could have an array of strings. So let's let other array equals donuts and cupcakes and I don't know, cookies. All right, so again, it's just a collection of items. Important thing about arrays is that they are ordered. So there's an ordering to this. This is at index 0, this is at index 1, this is at index 2. You can retrieve values using the index values. So if I wanted to do a console log of my array at index, let's say 3, this is, I'm saying access the item at index 3. Always keep in mind that arrays are 0-based index, meaning the first index is index 0. So this is index 0, this is index 1, index 2, index 3. So if I did a console log of my array at index 3, I should get the value of 2 from my array and print it out to the console. We could do the same for console log, index 0, other array, I like donuts, so we'll print out index 0, that's referring to the first item in my other array. So if we ran this code, notice we get the value of 2, because that is the third index 3, the value located at index 3, and the value located at index 0 is donuts, so we got donuts printed out here. You can mix and match data types. You do not have the same data types in an array. So if I want to change my other array, I could add integers here, like 55. I could add Booleans here, true, false, whatever. They don't have to be matching data types. You can even have arrays within arrays. Sometimes there is a use case for this. So I could add another array here. Let's say, this array is going to have 6. Let's have some vegetables in here. So onions and false. Again, this isn't really a sensible data type. Like, I don't know what use case I'd create an array like this, but it is possible. You can have arrays within arrays within arrays. There's no real limit. But just understand you can put any data type within an array, even another array. The important thing, again, arrays are ordered structures, meaning if you put something, if I want to add something to an array, so let's do, this array kind of got unwieldy, since we go back to my original array. You can add new elements. If I do my array, there's a method called push, which will add it to the very end. So if I do a push and add a value of 77, and then console.log my array, we should see that 77 got added to the very end. Yep, there it is. Okay, so these aren't a random collection. There's an ordering tool. Notice there's a difference between ordering and sorting. Sorting means there's, you might be increasing or decreasing or have whatever criteria. Sorting and ordering are different concepts. They get interchanged sometimes. Ordering just means you have some order, as in some sequence that you have established. In this case, I've said 3, 4, 8, 2, 6 is my sequence. So that is the ordered, it's an ordered collection. Any questions on arrays? You can take values out of arrays by doing pop. That will remove it from the end. There are other methods like I think shift. Shift removes an item from the front. I'm not going to go over every array method, but if you are curious, you can definitely Google JavaScript array. And yep, Mozilla docs are pretty good. So this will tell you all the methods that exist. So notice that we talked about some of them. We talked about pop and push. But there's also a reduce. There's a map function. There's a for each. Again, there's a ton of them. So get familiar with them. We'll go over some of them together. But these are, reading documentation is the name of the game here, because we're not going to talk about all of them. But there are 3, I guess really 2 that I really want to focus on, because we're going to be using these a lot, and I want you all to be comfortable with them. So there is a function called map. Let new array equals my array dot map. What does map do? Map actually goes through your array. It's kind of like a for loop, and it's going to create a brand new array based on it. It's not going to modify my original array. Map allows me to pass in a function. So let's say I create a function in here. Add 1. We'll take in a number and simply return num plus 1. So what this is going to do, I'm going to pass a function here. So map is going to call this function for every value in the array, and then it's going to add 1 to it and add that new element to my new array. So I do console.log new array. I should see that it's going to be my array with all these values added by 1. Let's confirm that. So notice I get 4, 5, 9, 3, 7, which is basically adding 1 to all these. So again, what is map doing? Again, it's not easy to understand this right off the bat if you never used it. Map is basically going to manually go through your array. Sorry, these tooltips are annoying. Go through your array one by one, capture a value and pass it to the function that you give it. So here I've told it add 1 is the function I want you to use to create my new elements. So it's going to take each value, pass in the value as a parameter, return the new value, which is just adding 1 to the original. And that's what my new array is going to have in it. Andrew, you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick question about map. So you have to pass through a function. It can't just be like plus or something like that.
Correct. You need a function to handle the input. So the inputs are going to be each element. So each element in this case are numeric values. That's why I'm taking in num as my parameter. But yes, anything in your array will be passed to your function, and your function can do whatever it wants with it. In this case, I'm adding 1. I could, multiply by 7, whatever I want to do. That's up to me, right? Sean, you have a question?
Yeah, I had basically the same question. I was going to ask, so you have to put in a function in the parameter, correct, for map?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
This actually is a function. Now, notice this is a key thing, and I guess I was going to go over this with the functions, but you don't call the function here. So let's table this for a second, because we talk about functions in detail a little bit more, but I don't want to put parentheses here because I'm not calling this function right now. My map function is going to call this function, so I don't put parentheses. That is an important thing to understand. And I'll talk about that when we talk about functions in JavaScript. But to understand, map is a handy function. Don't shy away from it because it is really beneficial, especially when we get into React. Map is used a lot there. There's also a function called filter, which lets you kind of trim down your array. So in this case, you can pass a function. Let's create a new function here. Function, say greater than 4. So this will let you selectively take items. But in this case, you're returning a Boolean. Notice I'm not returning a numeric value. I'm returning a Boolean. It's going to be a true or false. If I return true, then my new array is going to have that value. If this function returns false for any value that's passed into it, that value won't be added to my array. So if I want to use filter, let's pass it greater than 4. And now if I manually do this in my head, 3 is not greater than 4, so that should not be my new array. 4 is not greater than 4, so that should not be my new array. 8 is greater than 4, so I should get a true here. 2 is not greater than 4, but 6 is. So my new array should have only 8 and 6 in it if I've done this correctly. So again, filter takes in a function. That function returns a Boolean telling the filter function if it should add the new value to the resulting array. So I ran this. Notice we get 8 and 6. All right, so those are arrays. There's a lot of array methods that we'll get familiar with, but I just want to give a basic introduction there. Joe, you have a question?
If it does it individually, if filter does that individually for the whole array, what do you need to do so that it grabs the array as a whole? If anything in there fails, the whole thing.
That's a good question. So you want to say if anything in here is like not greater than 4, return nothing?
Correct.
That's a good question. Maybe, let's see, filter.
Is that, sorry, is that the sum method? Or is that a sum?
Dot sum. Let's take a look at that. So, yep, dot sum. Good suggestion there. Sum method tests whether at least one element in array passes. So in this case, we want the opposite of sum. So I think there's a dot all for every. Yes, there's a dot every. So Joe, for your question, you probably want to use the every method, where this will check if everything, as the name implies, if all the elements satisfy some condition. So in this case, their example is every value less than 40? So we do dot every, pass it the is below function, and then if that is if everything is below that, you get a Boolean value back, true or false. Yep. So again, there's many handy functions here. There's a lot to go through, so we're not going to go through all of them, but definitely a lot to discover. So that's basically a brief intro in arrays. Any questions on arrays? Again, there's more methods. We'll talk about them more. We're just trying to give a quick introduction here. So let's move on to.
Hang on, sorry. Before you move on from arrays, I just want to add on one other method I think is very important: sort. I think it's really important that people learn how to use the sort method on arrays, in JavaScript in particular, but whatever language you're using. I feel like this is one thing, like mastery of the sort method, that distinguishes a beginner programmer from an intermediate. It's a really powerful tool in a lot of situations.
Yep. So if you want to sort our array for numeric values, it's actually not trivial because it converts it all to strings, I believe. So notice if you sort this array using just sort alone, it's going to convert them to strings first. So notice it has 1, then 100,000, then 21, because alphabetically ones come before 2. So that's something to keep in mind. So sort will sort it based on strings. If you want to sort it numerically, you got to do something extra.
Yeah, you need a comparison function. Sort is not very useful, just called on its own.
Yeah, so there's ways to sort. Again, if you need to sort your data, sort is a good array method. So again, there's a bunch of array methods to go through. We'll definitely talk more about some more of them later on in the cohort, but I just want to introduce you to the idea that arrays are really powerful. They have great methods you can use to kind of achieve what you're trying to do. They're not just simply containers, they have methods with them too. Let's talk about objects. So objects, on their hand, so arrays are an ordered collection of values. Sorry, an ordered collection of key value pairs. So objects, on the other hand, they're not necessarily ordered, but they basically map one thing to another. So again, I like the term dictionary, and that's what Python uses, where you need to look something up based on a key. So that key would be the word you're looking up. And then the value in a dictionary's case would be the definition for that word, right? So imagine going to a physical dictionary, you know that you want to look at let's say I don't know the definition of collection. I know collection is the word I want to look up. The definition I get back is the value. So the way objects work, let's say my use curly braces to define objects, and then you give it key value pairs. So I could say, donuts can be my key, and my value can be yummy. So now this is saying, if I want to get to the value of yummy, I need to use this key, which is donuts. You could have integers as key, so I could do 1 here and say, 1. I could have just a descriptor, so I could say some key, so that will lead to some value. So again, you can have many different types of keys. So you'd have strings, integers, and just a descriptor. If you want to get a value out of here, use the key to get the value. You can't go in the other direction as easily. You can't say, hey, I have a value, give me the key for it. It is possible, but it's not how dictionaries are meant to be used. It's usually a one-way operation where you have a key, you want a value. So if I want to console log something out of my dictionary, I could do my object. Let's print out some key. All right, so if I did this, again, it's going to look in my object. So I keep saying dictionary, but my object can look for some key and then give me the associated value with it. So if I do node main.js, notice I get some value out of it. One thing I do want to point out here, I didn't use a string here for my key, but I did have to use it here. It's kind of interesting why that's the case. And here, if I just write some key here, it's going to think I'm using a variable that I've not defined. So if I try to run this, pretty sure I'll get an error. Notice it says, okay, you haven't told me what some key is. It's looking for a variable called some key, and I can assign that to, some key or whatever else I want to assign it to. So again, in your object, you can kind of just create a descriptor or a label is how I kind of describe it. But when you're trying to access it, you need to access it via the string value of it. So I could do this. Again, that gives me what I want. Again, this is a key value pair. You should not assume that they're ordered. Now, different languages have different implementations. I think in Python, they are ordered as of like Python 3.7, but I would not rely on objects being ordered. I think for JavaScript, there's a weird ordering. I think numbers first, then strings, and then other types. Don't quote me on that, but just don't think that just because I have donuts first here, it's going to be the first item in my object. There's no idea of first. It's just a collection where you kind of request via a key and you get a value out of it. It's not like, okay, my first value is donuts and yummy, second value is 1, 1, third value is that. Again, there's no ordering for objects. All right, if I want to add a new value, I could do my object, new value, let's say equals onions. That's fine. Let's print out my entire object, console log my obj, see what it looks like after I add that value. So notice that my new value got added here as onions. Also, what I want to point out, notice how it's displayed in the console. So notice I had donuts first, then 1, then some key. But notice that the ordering seemingly changed because there's no set order. So here, the way it's printed out, it's numbers first, then I guess labels. But you should not rely on any set ordering for an object. All right, so those are some more advanced data types. Any questions on using objects or arrays? Brendan?
Yes, I have a question on what's the distinction between an object and an array of arrays? Because they're both seem ordered and you can call them in a similar way.
So yeah, let my array equals, 1, 2, 3, sorry, 1, 2, 3, then 4, 5, 6. Yeah, so this is an array of arrays where you have arrays inside of arrays. And these are ordered. So I know precisely what index this is at. This is at index 0. It's never going to change unless I manually change it. And I know how to, again, if I do index 0 and index 1, that should give me this 2. So if I want to do something like console.log my array at index 0, that's saying grab the first item, which is this array, and I could chain on another array access and say, let's get index 1 out of it. So I'm saying, get me the first item, and then within that first item, get me the index 1. So this should print out a value of 2 because it's an array within an array. Again, dictionaries are key value based. So I need to know the key, and that give me the value. You can have arrays in here. So for example, I can have 1, 2, 3 here, but it's not the same concept. This has ordering to it. This does not have ordering. It's kind of just like a hodgepodge where you need a specific value to get a specific key to get what you want out of it. It's similar how you access it. Yeah, you use square brackets, but they are two totally different data structures that have different use cases. So if you can index something, use arrays. Again, these don't have indices, right? A donut is not an index, it's just a string value. So in this case, I don't have indices I can rely on. I have different types of values. So in this case, I'm going to use an object instead of an array. Aiden?
Yeah, question about objects. Is dot notation acceptable still, or is that not?
Nope. It is absolutely, sorry, yes, it is absolutely valid. So thank you for bringing that up. So I could do some key here. This is another way to access the same thing I was doing before. So if I did console.log myObject.someKey, yep, you can use dot notation. That is valid as well. Okay, Katerzaya.
Yeah, I was wondering, when we're writing our own code, sometimes for coding challenges, it might be really simple to solve it if you're like converting, for example, just to create an object of key value pairs. But it also kind of then seems like a really simple solution where like, which won't be available to us if we're like in the future working in like a large database or something where we're not writing the objects or like the data that we're manipulating, the data structures. So I'm wondering, like, for us as newer developers, should we come up with solutions that are like really simple like that, or should we try to push ourselves to like manipulate the code like as if we weren't responsible for writing the data structure?
If I think I understand the question correctly, it's the question, again, correct me if I'm wrong, is what if we are just converting something? Let's say we want to add 1. One way you could do it is like I could have a one here and a 2 here and say, or if I need to add 1, the result's gonna be 2 and 3. You could do this if your data set's really limited, but this is not the right way to approach it because again, you should be able to take in a value and just do num plus 1, right? So this shouldn't be used for converting. It's again to kind of relate things together. If you need to again do something more algorithmically, hard coding into an object is not solving the problem. It's just saying, hey, I know the answers ahead of time, so it's going to create like 50 different records for it. That's not the best way to do it. For example, if you guys remember from your pre-work challenges, you had Caesar cipher, right? Maybe you had to convert an A to B and B. Like if you're shifting it by 1, well, you don't want to hard code all those in because it can work, right? B maps to C and so forth. And you could use this object to say, all right, I have an A, I need to shift it by 1. What's the answer? B. But again, that's really manual and not algorithmic way to do it. Was that your question? I don't know if I understood it correctly.
Yeah, basically, yeah. Like that's what I always thought. But like in CS50, they talk about a little bit, and sorry if I'm getting ahead of it, but like a little bit about big O notation, and they talk about how the cache tables are the most efficient. So I was kind of just curious whether that's true, but if that's out of the scope of what we're talking about.
Yeah, so yeah, objects are pretty efficient when you're looking up items. So they are, again, they're widely used, but they shouldn't be abused, I guess, in terms of you're trying to solve, like calculate something, you're not going to store the values, like the end values to make it more efficient. You should actually calculate them because there's probably infinite possibilities that you need to calculate. Brendan?
Yes, so I'm pretty sure I've come across this where I get an object, but it doesn't, as an output of a loop or something I've been doing, and it doesn't have a key that I'm aware of. And I'm not sure, I guess I always have trouble figuring out what that key is when I don't see it.
Okay, let's table that thought. So we're getting to for loops, which will cover how to maybe iterate over these, but thanks for bringing that up. Yilin?
Yes, I just want to verify. So when you're using square bracket to access the value,
Yeah.
you have to put string type within the square bracket.
Yes.
What if the key is an integer? Do you still put it as a string as well?
Yes. So if I had, 1 here, I would want to use 1 in string here. Those mean the same thing.
Okay, and if it's the dot notation, did you just put integer?
I don't think you can use integers like this. Notice I have a red squiggly here. So there are limitations to the dot notation. I'm not sure if there's some way to escape this, but I usually use square brackets just so I use the same kind of method each time. Yeah, in this case, if I have 1 here, I don't think, you can't put string on it. That's not going to work. So in this case, if you have an integer, you need to use square brackets.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Let's see if you use 1 here, what happens. Might work because it might convert both of those to strings. Oops, that's some leftover code. Any other questions on objects? So yeah, I guess you could use it square brackets for the integer, but you can't use dot notations for integers. Okay, so those are your basic data types. Let's talk about variables. So declaring variables, I think Gidon had asked earlier. Well, yes, there's a few ways to declare variables. I could say, var equals something. I could also do let's my let's say other var equals other. I can also do const var equals something constants. Why do we have 3 different types of variable declarations, and when do you use them? Great question. So let's focus on let and const. We'll kind of talk about var at the very end. We're not really fond of var. We shouldn't be really using it unless there's a really, really good reason to. Let's talk about let. Let is the most common way you'll be declaring variables. This is a variable that can be modified and has limited scope. What do we mean by scope? So this is a good time to talk about scope. So let's say we have a function if let x equals true. If x, then let's say let y equals donuts, console log y. All right, so let's get this silly situation right here. Let creates a variable. So here I've created a Boolean variable. Here I've created a string variable. That's just holding on to a value, basically pointing at a value. So I've created this value, and y is referring to it. This variable I've created here has a scope. The scope means what's its lifetime, what's its neighborhood that it lives in. It lives in this scope. These 2 curly braces define the scope for my if statement. So this variable y that I've declared only lives within this part of my code. Once we get out of the scope, as in we get to this end curly brace, y no longer exists. So if I want to do console.log x, x lives out here, right? X is in this world because there's no other scope here. X is at the top scope. So I can access x because that is in the scope. But if I do console log y, let me get rid of this one. Y does not exist here because it has basically it's outlived its lifetime. It got born in the scope and it dies when it gets out of the scope. So if I try running this code, notice I get an error. It's saying y is not defined. This scope out here does not know about what got created here because this got created and destroyed. When that's done and over with, it no longer, the y variable no longer lives beyond what I've highlighted here. So that's how let works. Any scope you have, I can create scopes within scopes. So here I could do let z equals onions. If I do a console log here of z, this will also not work because I created another smaller scope within my other scope here. So z, again, only lives within these curly braces. So if I did want to print out the value of z, I can move my console log in here because now it has access to z because both of these are in the same scope. right? When we say scope, just imagine the level of curly braces you're in. So everything falls inward, but not outward. So if I want to, I could do a console.log of x here. Even though x got created, in the outer scope, it still is accessible inside here. So you can fall inward, I guess is what I meant to say. You can't fall outward. So x, we know what x is here. We have knowledge of what x is here because it's coming from the outer scope and automatically being accessible in the inner scope. But we can't do it the reverse. We can't say, hey, create y in our inner scope here and access it outside of that scope. So that is how let works. Let's talk about const. So let, if I have other var, I could set that to something else. New value. This is totally fine. I could do console.log of other var. That should work just fine. You can update it as many times as you want. So notice it says new value because I assigned it to a new value. But if I have const and let's say const var equals this, let's say I try to do const var equals that. Okay, so I create a variable, assign it right here, and I'm trying to change the value. Let's console.log const var and see what happens here. Notice you get an error because you explicitly told your application that this value should never change. And that's useful in certain cases. Like if I have a constant value like pi should never be anything other than 3.14, whatever the other digits are. So in this case, if I was using a value of pi, I'd create a const value because that's always going to be the same value. It's never should change, never needs to change. And that kind of protects you as a developer because if someone tries to modify the value of pi to be like, 4.44, well, you should rightly, get an error because pi should not equal 4.44. All right, so you should be using let most of the time. Sometimes you want to use const. So think about if your value should be changing or not and determine which one of the two you need to use. Then we have our third friend, which isn't really our friend because we don't want to use it. There's var. Var is the old way, kind of the old way of declaring variables. Before let and const even existed, var was the only game in town. So again, we don't really use var. There might be certain use cases where you might want to use it. Try not using it. Var is basically the same thing as let, where you can modify a value, declare a variable, and modify it and use it. But there are slight differences to var from let. As I mentioned, let is limited in scope. It's only defined for the scope that it was created in, everything inward. Var can actually jump out of a scope. So if you want to see this, let's go back to our example here. Sorry, I deleted it. I should put it around. Yeah, so we have let x equals 2. So when we had, let's simplify our example here. We had let y equal donuts, and we tried to print out y here. Remember, we got an error. But if we make this var actually lets it, you create it inside the scope, but it lets it jump out of the scope, which is kind of weird, but that's just the way var works. So notice here, now it's no longer complaining. It's saying, all right, cool, you declared a variable. I know it exists everywhere. It's kind of got, it can jump outside of the scope and live on after that scope dies. So again, we recommend not using var. There might be very, very few cases where you might want to use it, but usually you can use let and const and achieve everything you need to. To pretend var doesn't exist, we do need to talk about it because you might see it in legacy code, but most developers should be using let and const, but not var.
I want to add in a quick note, my thoughts on best practices versus on let and const. In a well-written program, most of your variables will never change. And so you should use const to indicate that to readers. It's only like in a for loop or some other unconventional situations where you might need to reassign a variable. And so then you can use let so people can see that easily. But for the most part, your variables shouldn't change. And you should give your readers the comfort of knowing that variables aren't going to be changing randomly by using const. If you see a variable that's defined at const at the top of the file, you kind of know right away that there's a limit to how much craziness is going to happen to it later on in the file. But if I see something defined at the top with let, I'm just like, oh gosh, like they could do anything with this in the rest of the file. I have no idea what's going to happen. I got to read really closely. So generally prefer const.
Porfi, you have a question?
Yeah, thank you. When we were doing the pre-work, something that did confuse me was I saw that they used const for, I believe it was like objects, but then you can still edit the content of the object like later on or something like that. I don't remember the exact case that they used it in, but I believe that was it.
Yes, so there are some more detailed things that we need to go over here. So we do have some more to get through, but I guess let's go this because it is important to know. Porphy mentioned, what if I had my array as const? My array equals 1, 2, 3, 4, keep it simple. Now the question is, can I do something like my array push and add a 5 value to it? The answer is yes, you can do this. And it might not be obvious why you can do this. So it is worth talking about. So let's do this quickly. Notice we get 5 added to it, even though I said this was const. What's going on here? The answer is I'm still referencing the same array. So this is just like if I said this equaled 1, I'm pointing to the value of 1, and I'm never changing that I'm pointing to the value of 1. But in the array case, I'm saying now I'm pointing to this array. Wherever this array lives in memory, I'm always using this array. And then I can add on to that array because it's still the same array as in the same data that I'm pointing to. I'm just kind of adding on to that data. This is different than if I went to my array and said, hey, let's make you equal 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is a brand new array, and this would not be allowed because I'm changing actually what it's pointing to. So again, it gets a little confusing, but just think of this as instead of an array, this is just an integer. It's always pointing to the value of 1 in this case. In the same way, I'm always pointing to my array that I created here, but that array might change, but it's still the same array that I'm referencing. I know that's going to take a while to maybe process, but just understand we are referring to the same thing, whether it's an integer or a string and array. The array, I'm not saying it's a different array. It's the same array, but the array might change in its form, but it's still the array I want to reference. So that's what Const is saying here is never change what array I'm referring to, but that array itself might change in terms of the data stored inside of it. Yeah, I know that's a lot to take in, so it's a good question to ask. Sean, you have a question?
Yeah, so can you make a variable and not set it, like not define it, like you want to define it later on? Does that make sense? Like you don't set it equal to anything?
You could set it to null or undefined
Okay,
if you want. So if I do let x equals null, this tells me I've not really set anything to it. So I could check later, like if x equal null, then I could say, all right, well, I need to give it a value. So x equals 1.
Okay. Like what if you just do let x and like leave it like that?
I don't think that'll be kosher. So if I try to run this, that is work, I guess.
And then
so
like you set the value like in another part of the code, you know what I mean?
I want to see what this actually sets it to. I think it's going to be undefined because we've not told it what it was. Yep. So
okay.
you can do this. It's undefined. Usually I would not recommend that. You set it to null at least rather than undefined. Undefined is not like a good data type to be working with. Okay. So that covers variables. So hopefully you understand let versus const versus var. Any questions there? Okay, so we are hitting lunchtime. I don't want to take away your lunchtime. So it is 12:06 here. We do have a little bit more material to go through. So let's do this game plan. Let's be back at 1 in the main Zoom room. We'll finish up our JavaScript introduction. And then we'll set out your pair programming partners also, and you'll have most of the afternoon to pair program on the challenges for today. If you do want to take a peek at the challenges, we could definitely do that. So, okay. Great, so we're just going over a few more basic JavaScript items. So following along on the curriculum page, we have arithmetic operators. These hopefully are pretty straightforward from your math class in, I don't know, 6th grade. Let's just go over them. If you have 2 variables, let's say x equals 6 and let y equal 3, you can do your basic operations like console.log just to see the value. You can do x plus y. That you would assume would be 9. You can do x minus y. Again, basic operators, nothing too exciting here, so I'm not going to spend too much time on them. Multiplication is the asterisk symbol. Division would be the /, so the one falling forward. We also can do exponents. So if you want to do x to the power of y, that's double asterisks. That might be useful for certain challenges. We also do the remainder. So I know if you guys remember from your pre-work assessment, you guys probably use the modular operator for the code platoon exercise. And this gives you the remainder of doing a division operation and then whatever's left over, as in you can't go in evenly. So if we ran this answer should be 9. This would be 3. 6 times 3 would be 18. Division, so x divided by y would give us 2, right? Because 6 divided by 3 gives us 2. The remainder of the operation would be 0 because 3 goes into 6 even amount of times. There's nothing left over once you do division. Exponent, I can't do this mentally. What's 6? So 36 times 6 again. What is that? 1, 2. I don't know what that is. But anyway, so the ones I want to pay attention to are division and modulo. So sorry, let's just do, what is 36 times 6? That is 216. I was not close. Okay, so 216. Let's focus on these two because there's a little more to talk about with division modulo. Any questions on the other ones, definitely ask. But division, how does division work? Well, right now we have numbers that divide evenly. What if I change this 6 to a 7? What should be printed out on these 2 lines is the question. So let me comment out the other guys because those should be more straightforward. So notice we get a floating point number because that is the remainder here. That's a full division. So you get the integer value and the leftover part. So 1/3 left over. The remainder though is not 0.33333. It is 1. It is the full value that's left over. So, we go dividing 7 by 3, we get, 4 divided by 3 because we subtract 1, 3, and then we go down to 1 divided by 3, and now 3 can no longer go into that number evenly, so we return that 1. Again, we're not returning 0.333. We're returning the whole number value that's left over. In this case, it's 1. Because we start with 7, take away a 3, take away another 3. Well, we can't take any more 3s away. So that's what modulo returns, the actual value left over, not the fractional representation of it. Just want to make that clear. Also, something to mention, other languages approach this in a different way. So sometimes when you divide an integer by another integer, you might actually just get 2. 7 divided by 3 in other coding languages will give you actually an integer value of 2. So I think this might go back to the comment of maybe all numbers in JavaScript are floating point numbers. That would make sense because that's why we get a floating point number back. But just know that other languages might handle this differently. So be wary of that if you're coding in something else. Okay, so those were arithmetic operators. Let's talk about logical operators. Again, these are pretty straightforward, but there's some discussion here. You can have many types of comparisons. So let's go back to let x equals 6, let y equals 3. All right, you can do your basic comparators like if x less than y, do something. You do greater than, just flip that sign. We've seen equals. So again, just to reiterate, equal will not care about the data types. So in this case, if I had y equals string value 6, this would result to true. However, if you do triple equals, the triple equals goes that extra step of actually checking the data type. So in this case, it'll say, wait, this is an int, this is a string, therefore these are not going to be equal. If you actually want to check not equals, well, the easiest way is just to flip the comparison by putting an or exclamation point. And this says if they are not equal, proceed to do something. All right, you could also do combinations. So you could do and. This means do multiple checks. So let's say we had another value like let z equals 13, 14. This can equal 3. So we could say if x not equals y and x not equal to z. The and says you got to do both of these and both of them must be true. So this has to be true and this has to be true in order for us to get into this if statement. If either one of these is false, we don't get into this if statement. The kind of the converse of that is the or statement. The or statement are double pipes. This means either this part has to be true or this part has to be true. So what if we did something like x greater than y, or see y greater than x, or x greater than z. This, only one of these had to be satisfied. So is y greater than x? Nope, 3 is not greater than 6. But we also want to check this. Is 6 greater than z? Nope, that's also false. We fail out of here. But if we did z greater than x, this would be true. Therefore, we'd get into this if statement. Because z is 14, x is 6, this part would be true. Again, if we had and though, this would not work, because since this part is false, this entire combination is deemed false. Any questions on the basic operators? So again, we have greater than, less than, not equal, and, or. I have a question, and let's see if we can find an answer to this. So the reason I wanted to focus on this, Porfi, you have a question?
Yeah, I was wondering, is there any limit to how many of those you can chain together?
Nope, great question. You could have 20 ands together, so long as it makes sense. Like, don't do it just because you want to try it out. But yeah, you can combine ands and ors. So my question to you, to anyone out in the audience, is what if I do something like x plus y greater than 8? What's going to happen here? Am I going to do y greater than 8 first and then add that to x, or am I going to do x plus y? What if I even flip this? Like, what if I did 8 less than x plus y? Does it go left to right? So is it going to check this first and then add it to y? Is it going to do this first? Like, how do I know? Does anyone have an answer?
Doesn't it go right to left? Like it's supposed to be different from normal mathematics?
So we can test this out. So let's actually test this out. Let's do console.log got in here. All right, so we're going to run this. So again, the question is, how does this comparison work, right? Because we're doing two things. We're doing comparison and an addition. So if I do node main.js, notice it got in there. Now, why did it get in there? Well, x is not greater than 8, so it obviously didn't do that part first. It actually does this first. Now, you might be thinking, well, how do I know? Like, how could you possibly know? Like, is it random? No, it's not random. This is a simpler case. But what if you had something complicated like x greater than 7, maybe equals z less than 20? Like, well, is it going to do this part? Sorry, does someone have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to say, my understanding is it goes math before logic.
That is true. It does do math before logic. But in this case, again, now we have two comparisons. We're doing this and this. Like, it gets kind of murky sometimes. So the answer is yes, there's an answer. It's not always obvious, but this is part of just either A, being more familiar with it, or reading documentation. So if you search for operator precedence, there's actually 19 levels of precedence. We're not going to go through all of them, but there's an order. So grouping gets the highest precedence. If you surround anything in parentheses, so this goes back to like basic math operations like x plus y times z. Well, if you remember from math class, multiplication always happens before addition. So in this case, y times z happens before x plus whatever. But if I wanted to do this first, I would group that in parentheses. That gets the highest precedence. So now I'll actually add x plus y before multiplying by z. So if you run through this table, it'll give you kind of a heads up of what happened before. So again, there's the plus plus operator, plus, minus. Again, I'm not going to go through this entire list, but there is a rhyme and a reason to it. It's not random. There's a set ordering that you can guarantee is always going to be honored. So we can go through this again. So there's less than, happens before equals. Equals is down here somewhere. I think I missed it. Equals has a lower precedence than the less than. So less than, greater than comparisons happen before equals. So you guys can kind of scan this. Again, there's a lot to go through. You don't have to memorize it. Just be aware that there is an order to it is what I wanted to focus on here. Okay, so take a gander at this. Just have some understanding that what happens before everything else. But you can always look this up. Always make sure you double check, because sometimes, again, it gets ambiguous. And this is a simpler example because it's math, but other comparators can kind of be questionable in terms of what happens before the other. All right, so those are logical operators. Any questions on those? Okay, so the main thing that we wanted to cover were functions. So functions, hopefully we've seen them before. So to create a function, we use the function keyword. This is a reserved keyword in JavaScript. We're gonna name our function. So I'm gonna name my function my func parentheses. This, you always need parentheses here, even if you're not gonna pass any parameters here. You want parentheses and then create the scope for that function. Open curly brace, closing curly brace. If I want to call my function, I need to call it from outside. So here would call my function, and anything inside of here will now execute. Important thing to know is that without this call on line 6, if I comment this out, whatever I have in here does not automatically execute. It needs to be called. Like it's like you're calling a friend that's going to do a task for you. That friend is not automatically going to do that task if you don't call them on the phone and say, hey, I need you to do this task for me. So if we do console.log in function, if I run my code, as I mentioned, since I'm not calling it, nothing happens. Like we go through this line of code, JavaScript's like, okay, you have a function, but I'm not going to execute anything because that you didn't tell me to do anything. But if we call my function here, now we should be able to execute anything that's in my function. Obviously, this is just doing a console log, but it could be complicated calculations, we do whatever. I could pass values with my function. So let's say I want to pass the value of 77. I can do this, but I can run this, nothing's bad's gonna happen. I'm just ignoring it. I'm passing a value, but not capturing it with a parameter in this function. That's fine in JavaScript. This is different in Python and other languages. JavaScript, this goes, you can pass extra parameters. It's not gonna care. So if I want to capture it, I could capture it in, let's say, a variable called num. Let's use string interpolation here. Print out num here. All right, so now we're passing this value. It's being captured in this parameter, which is basically a variable for this function. And now if I print it out, notice we pass 77 into the function, and now the function can use that parameter since we passed it in. What if I call my function without any value here? What's going to happen to num? Any guesses?
It'll be a null, right?
It won't be null. It'll be undefined. Null means
As a-
nothing. So if I actually pass null here, that'd be okay. But in this case, I'm not passing anything. So on this side, num's gonna be like, all right, I didn't even know what I'm supposed to be. That you didn't tell me what value I should assign myself to. So notice we get undefined for the value of num for the second case. But this is another thing about functions. You can set default values in this case. Let's say you expect someone to pass you a value, but in this case we didn't. You can say, well, if no one passes me a value, I want to take on a default value. Let's say our default value is going to be 88. This syntax might seem kind of weird, but this is saying if no value was provided from the function call, set num to 88. So if I ran this, the first time we are passing a value, so num is going to be 77, not 88. But the second one, we're not passing a value, so it will automatically take on 88. So this is called a default parameter, saying if you the caller, are not going to pass me a value, I will just automatically take a default value. You can have two variables. Let's say I have a variable of value and num. In this case, value has no default, so we could pass it. Let's go 100. I could pass this 99. In this case, value is the first parameter. Second one is optional. So this is how optional parameters are implemented, as we saw before. That with what function was it? I forgot what function it was. But these are optional parameters. Now we're saying if we don't pass this in, that's fine. We have a default value. So I ran this. Notice we get 100 here. I guess I'm not using value here. Question, Brendan.
So when you set the value like that, is that equivalent to using var or let when it's put forward?
It's kind of both. So something to talk about var, since you brought that up. I'd say treat this like a let. But if we used var here, let's say we create a variable here, var new value equals donuts. Var only has function scope. So we talk about the fact that var can jump out of scope. It can only jump out of block level scope, not functional scope. So what I mean by that, if I try to do a console log of new value here, even though I use the var specifier here, this is not going to work because var can only live as long as this function lives. It cannot jump out of function scope. However, if I had like an if statement of if num greater than 20, create var. In this case, var still exists here. So let me clean up my code here. var exists here. This will work. So sorry, new value will exist here because var can jump out of this block scope, but it cannot jump out of a function. So if I try to run this twice, I need to call my function with a value of 20, 30, 30, whatever. So I run this. Notice you get an error. The first one printed out with donuts. So I did get, it hit this because I called my function first, so it executed that. But my second one, it does not know what new value is. So var is still limited to function scope. It does not have the ability to break out of there. All right, so this is the traditional way of creating a function, but there's also, let's comment that, traditional function declaration. But there's also the idea of anonymous functions, also known as fat arrow functions in JavaScript, also known as inline functions. These names are all synonymous. They mean the same thing. Okay, the way you do this, it's a little odd syntax, but you specify the parentheses just like you would for this function. So let's actually replicate that. We do value and num equals 88. Then you use the syntax of a fat arrow. That's equal sign and then a greater than sign. So this is why it's called a fat arrow syntax sometimes, or fat arrow functions. And then you create the body for it. So this is the same thing as this. However, this function has no name. The name of this function is myfunc. This function has literally no name. That's why it's called anonymous. We don't know the name of it. You can store it in a variable though. So I could do let my anon func equal that. Now this variable is actually pointing to my function. So I actually can access it if I want to. All right, again, the syntax looks really weird. I understand if you've never seen it before, you're like, what's going on here? Just understand what I've highlighted right here. I've created a function on the spot. This is the same thing if I did let my regular function equal my func. All right, if you can see the parallel here, I created my function and I'm just pointing to it with my regular function variable. My non-function variable is pointing to another function. Again, important thing. I am not calling my function here. If I add parentheses here, that actually goes into the logic. Without the parentheses here, I'm just saying, hey, point to my function. And if at a later point in time, later on, I can call my reg function just like a function. So this is a variable, but it looks like I'm calling a function because this variable is pointing or referring to a function. So this is valid in my anon func. This is valid too, because both of these are referring to a function and you can call that function later on if you want to. Any questions on how I'm able to kind of store this in a variable? Again, it's just like instead of pointing to a function, you could point to an integer, you could point to an array. In this case, you could also point to a function saying, hey, this is my function, use it as a function later on if you want to. So anonymous functions are beneficial when you only need the function like right on that line. So in this case, if I only need to do this logic once, I might create an anonymous function if I'm not going to reuse it. So that is possible. So I could, do a console log in here, just like I did before, whatever wants to go there. You may occasionally see this without curly braces. For example, if I leave these curly braces off, this can still work. The only thing is you can only have one line here. If you try to add another line, like, another console log, it's going to yell at you. In this case, you need to put this in curly braces. So if you have more than one line, you need to wrap this in curly braces. Without the curly braces, it's going to assume that the one line you have is what you're returning here. So if I had something as simple as num plus 1, it's actually going to return this. It's the same thing as writing return num plus 1 up here. Let's clean this up a bit. So without the return statement, this will still implicitly return from this anonymous function. This is only when you have one line of code in your anonymous function. If you have multiple lines, you need curly braces, and then you need to have a return statement here too. All right, so again, anonymous functions seem kind of scary. Please get comfortable with them. Don't feel like you have to use them right now, but they will be beneficial going forward. So definitely don't shy away from trying to explore with them. Give it your best shot. If you're stuck with them, ask for help, or you can kind of revert back to traditional syntax if you're more comfortable with that later on. Joe, you have a question?
Is there any way to address an anonymous function without naming it?
This is the only way you can refer to it later on. So again, anonymous function, by its definition, it's just, there's no name to it. If you want to hold on to it, you need to assign it to a variable. So that variable keeps track of, okay, you create this anonymous function. I know where it is. I can kind of get you in contact with it. It's like a friend of a friend. So let's say I don't know my friend's friend. I have that friend here. It says, okay, I'll connect you with that friend later on if you need to.
Then is there a way to set it to just?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch it.
I was wondering if there's a way to set it to auto run if you have to call it in that.
If you want to call a function here, then you need to you would just do, num plus 1. So yeah, if you need to do the logic, you just write the logic. If you want to do it later, that's why we create functions. It's logic that's stored that can be called whenever we want to.
Thank you.
Okay. Shun, you have a question?
Yeah, can you make the anonymous function? Does it need to have a parameter?
It does not.
Okay, cool.
So this is the simplest anonymous function you can create. Empty parameter lists doing nothing at all. This is the equivalent if I created a function up here that just did nothing and took in nothing. Now you're not going to really see this, but again, this is still a valid function. I can still call this function. It's going to do nothing for me, just like my function here is doing nothing. Yeah, you don't need to return something. You don't technically need to do anything, but you still need the parenthesis here, because that's a syntax for creating an anonymous function. I can't just leave this off and say, like, that's not going to work. It needs to know that you're trying to create an anonymous function.
Yeah, maybe you can show like the map method and how maybe like using like an anonymous function and a map method, maybe that
Absolutely,
will, like,
good suggestion
show.
there. So let's say we have our myfunc, and this is going to be num plus 1. We talked about how if I have an array, so we have let my array equals 1, 2, 3, 4. Keep it simple. We talked about the map method, kind of just to ignite that discussion. Let my new array, let's use map. So map my array dot map. One way I could do this is pass it my func and telling it, hey, call this function for every value in my array. Another way I could do this, I could do my array dot map, and instead of creating this function ahead of time, I could create that in line. Again, if I only need to do this logic here, I could pass this as an anonymous function, num plus 1. Both of these lines will create the same exact, or the identical arrays. So my new array and my other array will have the same exact values in it. There'll be two different arrays with the same values in it. So this, again, is creating a function on the spot where we take in a value of num, and we're going to return num plus 1, just like, oops, sorry. This needs a return statement. That is not optional. Here it is optional, but here we do need to return it. But both of these are doing the same thing. Again, I know the syntax is kind of wonky. It'll take some time to get used to, but understand that it is a very developer-friendly thing to have anonymous functions. What questions do you guys have about anonymous functions or functions in general? Again, one thing I want to highlight, console log num plus 1 versus returning. And again, this was sort of a common question during the pre-work. What's the difference here? Again, console log, this only prints to the console. This actually gives back a value to whoever called the function. So in this case, if I'm calling my function, let's get rid of my map. If I call my func, I don't have to accept a return value. So let's say I pass in 77, I should get 78 back from this, but I could ignore the return value. That's my choice as the caller if I want to capture or not. In this case, I could say let results equals this. Now I call my function, It goes into the function, passes in 77. It's going to print out 78 to the console. And that's also going to return me 78 here. So now I can do whatever I want with, I could do console log results plus 2. That should get me 80 because I got 78 back from my func, and then this should be 80. So that's how you pass values into a function via parameters, and that's how you pass values out of a function via return statements. Make sure you understand the difference between console log and returning. That is vital to know. Good. Any questions on functions? All right, well, go for it, Ivan.
So in your like expertise, when would you use like a self-invoked function, and when would you use like a anonymous function? Like, is there just like, I know like the issue, I don't think, but like they can kind of do the same thing if you really wanted to.
What do you mean by self-invoked? Like I'm doing it right here?
No, when you like wrap it around parentheses and then you basically call it within its own function. So it's like you put parentheses around the function that you create, and at the end, before you close the parentheses, you call it, like you do another set of parentheses, and it self-invokes. It treats that function as like anything, like it's like it's really just like it's the function calling itself.
You mean recursion? So if I called right here?
No, it's I thought feel later about it. It's just
okay,
like
yeah. Let's take it offline, but I am curious. Okay, cool. So that covers functions. Last little bit we want to cover just control flow in your application. So we have if statements. This should be a review, but again, definitely want to spend time if needed. Again, we have conditions. So let's say let x equals 8, let y equals 6. We could do if x is greater than y. Do something here. Console log x is larger than y. We do an else. So the else catches everything that is not caught by this. Else just means catch everything else. We can do console log x is not greater than y. We could also chain else ifs. We've seen this before. So we do, what if we did x equals y? That's our special case. We could put this here. Again, I assume most of you guys are familiar with if statements, so I don't want to spend too much time on them. Is equal to y. But again, you could have as many else ifs as you want, so long as you have particular cases. We saw this for the def grandma challenge where we had 2 else ifs kind of added on because we only want one of these to fire. That's why you chain if and else ifs together. If you want a totally different if statement, you can create that. So if x times 2 is greater than y, again, this is totally separate from what we want to do before maybe. The one thing I want to talk about for if statements, more syntax. I know you guys are probably drowning in syntax at this point, but ternary operators. Ternary operators. These are one-line if statements, and they should be used but not abused. So the way you do this is, let's say I want to do something like what I had before, like this, where I have x greater than y, console log this, or console log that. I can write that in a single line if statement called ternary operators by doing something like, let me actually, let's say I want to put this into a variable. Result equals that, or results equals that. Let results equal null. All right, so in this case, the result's always going to be set to something. It's either going to be x is larger than y or x is not greater than y, right? So if I want to do this in an easier way, I could kind of condense all this into a single line by doing let my results. And then this gets a little weird in terms of syntax, but you do your comparison just like you were doing before. So your if statement has a comparison, and then you use the question mark operator, and then you put your true case. So in this case, I want this, and then your false case comes after the colon. So a lot of times you'll see a ternary run like this. I know that's kind of scary, like, whoa, there's question marks, there's colons, there's a comparison, what's going on? Again, this is literally an if statement just done on one line. It checks the condition first. If that is true, it's going to give you back this part. Also, it's going to give you back this part and assign that to your variable. That's essentially what we're doing here. But instead of having, like 4 or 5 different lines, we're just doing this in one line. I prefer when I'm writing this, again, this is just my preference. I usually like breaking this down into 2 separate lines. Again, the spacing in JavaScript doesn't matter. You can create new lines. So here, this makes it easier for me to read where I'm like, okay, cool. This is the true case, this is the false case. It makes it easier for me to read. So formatting, there's different ways you might see it. I usually break it down to new lines. Again, this is the same thing. Adding new lines in JavaScript does not matter, which is not true for Python. So just giving a Python heads up. New lines do matter in Python. Andrew, you have a question?
Yeah, just why'd you make result equal to no?
So this is where I'm saying I don't know what it is, but I want to specify it's going to be nothing. So I could leave that as undefined, but usually I don't like leaving variables unassigned. So here I'm going to set it to null, and then if I console log it later, results, then it's going to be either one of these. But if I ever see it null, I know that I specifically set it to null. So I'm just saying I don't know what result is right now, but I know it's going to be something later. The reason I'd prefer a ternary here is I always know I want to assign something, but instead of doing it like this, I'm just kind of doing it all in one line where I create a variable, check a condition, and assign that variable based on the result. So again, you don't have to use ternary operators ever, but they are convenient in certain cases, especially like right here. I would argue this is much easier to write and understand than rather doing something like this where you create a variable but don't yet assign it because you need to assign it later based on some condition. Just want to introduce that again. If you want to totally ignore ternary operators, more power to you. We're not going to force you to use them, but you may see them in code that you're reading or elsewhere. Okay, so we have if statements. We also have our friendly for loops. We've seen this before, so let's create an array. Let my array equals 1, 2, 3, 4. Keep it simple. Actually, I need to change this. Let's go 5, 6, 7, 8. We can iterate through this array by doing our usual for loop, where we create a iterating variable. In this case, I is an iterating variable we're creating. We're going to check if that's less than my array.len, and then plus plus I. So again, for loop has 3 parts in this form. We create a variable, our condition. So long as this condition is true, this loop will continue. Whenever this becomes false, the loop will stop. And then the iterating method that we're doing. In this case, we're iterating by 1. But again, we don't have to iterate by 1. We could iterate by 2. I could say I equals I plus 2. It's going to skip over every other index. So we'll start here, go to this index after that. All right, so just know that it doesn't always have to be by 1. You can take it, have your increment be whatever you want. You could even have a function here saying, hey, get next value and pass in something. So like, I don't know what this might be doing, but maybe it's returning you a random I value. Maybe it's, I don't know what it could be doing. Maybe it's like Fibonacci sequence is the next increment. Who knows? But just know that you don't always have to do I++. Andrew, you got a question?
Yeah, for the for loop, where the beginning part where you put let I equals 0.
Yep.
So I remember this because I made a mistake in one of like my work, but I used to just write I equals 0. That makes a global variable, right?
I believe this is the same as doing var. So to check that, let's actually do a console.log of I here and console.log I here. So if I think this correctly, if this is a var, this should be valid. We should be able to print I here, and that will be the length of the array. So this should be, I should be 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then let's put outside of loop. And I'm not going to tag that. Right. So if we run this, notice we get outside of loop 6, but if we make this a let, that I should not exist outside of the for loop scope. Let's check that out. Maybe I'm wrong. Yep, we got an error. So yeah, without specifying, it's going to default to var. But always be explicit. Never kind of let the interpreter decide for you. Okay, so this is your typical for loop. But there are some other formats of for loops that you can use, and sometimes they're a bit more beneficial to use. Let's say we had an object. So let's go back to our object example. Let's create an object of donuts. They're yummy. And then what else? We have, I actually hate green beans. So we'll put that. And to me, green beans are yummy. All right, so again, objects are key value pairs where if I pass it the key, it should give me the value back out of it. Now going from value to key, as we mentioned, is not how objects should be used. So that's not the use case for this. If I want to actually go through this, you can use a special for loop in the format of let key equals, let key in my obj. And then let's do a console. What's that? Console.log key. What this is going to do is going to iterate through every single key in your dictionary and then give you the key value. So if I only care about the key, I could do it. This is one way to do it. Oops, got that error. Let's get rid of that. So notice it prints out donuts and green beans. What if I actually swap these? Remember we told you that things aren't necessarily always ordered in the way you add them in, right? Because anytime I go through this array, 5 and 6 and 7 are always going to be in this order. What if I swap these and then try going through a for loop? Okay, looks like it preserves the order there. I'm kind of surprised by that. But anyway, we have access to the keys by doing let key in my obj. And this is just a variable. I can name this whatever I want. I can call it K if I want to. Anything I want to name it. It's just a variable I'm creating. It's going to go through your keys. If you actually want the values, you do console.log my obj. Remember, this is how we access things in our object. We have my object, pass it the key. We do it through square brackets. Pass it K. This will give you the value out of it. So this will give you yucky or yummy. So if we ran that, notice we get green beans is yucky, which is true, and donuts are yummy, which is also true, in my opinion. Let's see. So that's, again, for iterating through objects, this is one way you do it. You can also take advantage of some other methods. So if you want to do a quick search, objects JavaScript. There are other ways to access the keys and or objects or the values inside of an object. So there's something called entries. There's also a method called keys and values. So again, if you only care about the values, you can do object.values. So I can do object.values and pass it my object. So let's quickly do that. Let's do objects.values, pass it my objects. Now these are going to be values, so just to clue you into that, I'm going to rename my variable to v. And these should print out only the values without the keys. So notice, that's all I want. Object.values. How did I screw that up? Oh, it's an array. Oh, so I guess it gives you an array there. So, oh, I need to do of. So we get yucky and yummy. Quick thing, I know there's a question out there. Why did I switch this to of? This actually burned me when I was trying to code something. It took me forever to discover this, as in what I was doing wrong. If you're iterating through an array, you can use another syntax for let value in of my array. Make sure you use of and not in. It is really tempting to use in because that's how I would kind of phrase it for every value in my array, but this is not going to get you where you want it to. So if I actually console log these values, it's going to be the indexes, not the actual values that I want. All right, so let me comment that out. So again, this little word makes a huge difference. If I run this, my ARR, notice I get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are the index values from within my array. That's effectively the keys for this array are the index values. If I actually want the values, you want to do of. And it's easy to forget. 2 small words make a big difference. So if I clear this and run it, notice I get the actual value of that. So just to reiterate right here, what I was doing my iteration on object.values, the reason I had to switch this to of, because I was reading documentation, and documentation tells me that the object.values returns an array. So an array, if I want to get the values in the array, I need to actually use of and not in. So make sure you pay attention to that. If you use this format, again, usually I use the traditional for loop format because I'm comfortable with that. And that's simple enough for me. So dealer's choice on which for loop method you want to use. These can be kind of easier to read for some people, but you don't have to use them by any means. Porphy, you got a question?
Yeah, you lost me a little bit here. So for one thing, for loop, if you use let, you're still just setting up a value or
Yep.
a variable.
Yep.
And then the in keyword tells the loop essentially to iterate through all of the indexes in whatever object you put in it. And then that'll be the value of k, or
Yes, so just make sure we're using the right terminology. Objects do not have indices. They simply have keys. So the in here is going to give you all the keys back. So it's going to give you green beans and donuts back. And if you actually want the values, that's when you again access the values doing my obj with the key. So you insert the key and get the value out of the object. So this will give you again the yucky or the yummy, and then the k here is simply the key values. So this for loop is giving you all the key values, and then if you need the value, you can access it through your object. Andrew.
So in the past, I've just seen it as like for key and value. Are you only putting the let there because you want to like log it? Because
sorry,
just
you
like,
do like this?
Yeah, just like for like key and value or something like that. It's the way I've seen it classically. Like you're just putting the let there so that, because if you do key and value, you're not really creating a value, like a variable that can like go outside of the thing in the first
Sorry,
place.
you're
right?
saying, is this what you meant, k and my obj?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, so this is the same discussion as we had before in terms of if you don't put this, it's going to be interpreted as a var. So this k will live on outside of this for loop, the last
Okay.
k value. So again, I always just am explicit about it, and I encourage you guys always to be explicit because there's no reason why k needs to exist out of this for loop. If you do have a case for it, then sure, you could use var, and then you could use console log your last k value here, because this will be your last k value, but most times I don't think you're ever going to need to do that. So yeah, always try to use let. Get in the habit of writing let explicitly. Don't leave off those qualifiers. All right, so we talked about for loops. Hopefully you guys are comfortable with those. For loops cousin that we've talked about before is the while loop. We covered this during our challenge in the morning. So just to reiterate it, we can do a for loop, or a while loop. Question is, when do you use one over the other? Let I equals 0, I less than my r dot length. So again, rule of thumb, when you have something like an array that's going to have a fixed size, you know how many iterations you need to do because the size of this is not going to change on you. It shouldn't. I mean, I guess it could. But in this case, I would use a for loop because I know exactly how many iterations I need to do. A while loop is used maybe for like, again, our deaf grandma challenge. We didn't know how many times we need to, keep conversing with our grandmother. So in that case, a while loop is preferable because we don't know when you don't know how many times you need to iterate. All right, so again, this might be, we could do like, let's say, let's I equals 0, while I is less than 100. Let I equals math dot random 100. So this will basically get you a random number that's between 0 and 200, and we'll execute this while loop until we get a value that is greater than 100 in this case. So if we want to kind of see this in action, nothing too exciting. Console.log I. All right, so in this case, I don't know how many times this loop is going to execute. Might execute once and give me a random number that's greater than 100. Might execute 20 times until it gets a number that's higher. So this is when I'll use a while loop when I don't know how many times exactly it's going to loop. So let's give this a run. All right, so the first time happened to be a number greater than 100. What if we make the range a little smaller? We'd say 120. So we have a 20% chance roughly, or it's a 16% chance of getting a number that is higher than 100. So notice we tried 3 times. We got 43 the first time, 91, then we finally got a number greater than 100. So again, a while loop makes sense because I don't know how many times it's going to execute. All right, but for the most part, you can use a while loop or a for loop interchangeably. They're both going to work. They're doing the same thing, just you're doing repetition. That's what a loop is for. But always be cognizant of maybe why a while loop might make more sense in some cases versus a for loop. There's also a cousin here that's called a do. while loop. I'm not going to talk much about it. You should never need to use this. It exists. Maybe you can find a use case for it, but anything you do with a do while loop, you can do with a while loop. So I'm not going to talk about it. If you're curious, do a quick Google. You can find out about the do while loop. Cool, cool, cool. All right, so I think that covers everything we wanted to cover. Again, just want to give a good introduction into JavaScript. So if you have any questions about anything today, please ask. Again, we encourage questions. If you have anything you're unsure about, want to make sure we're clear on it, or reach out in the afternoon and we talk one-on-one. If you're like, hey, not sure about anonymous functions, can we talk about those more? Happy to kind of either talk one-on-one or have a breakout session if multiple people have that question. All right, so that was our JavaScript fundamentals. Definitely review if you need more practice, do Googling, make sure you understand anonymous functions, understand for loops, understand let versus var versus const. Again, all the things we talked about should be basic knowledge by the end of today, because we're going to be using JavaScript throughout the cohort. So I want to make sure you guys are good with today. So we have a number of challenges as we went over. Let me stop the recording here.